Bendigo goldfields, like all the goldfields in the central Otago, had their beginnings with the discovery of gold in the Clutha River, just below Cromwell, by Hartley and Riley in the winter of 1862 of great quantities of gold. Now, when the news of this discovery was published, the hundreds of miners from other parts of Otago and overseas converged on the spot, and it wasn't very long before they started to fan out over the whole of the inland Otago in the search for gold. And in due course, they, working their way up the Clutha River and over Thompson's Saddle, they converged on this spot here, this flat area you see out here. And they found that it contained, underneath the gravels, quite rich deposits of gold, alluvial gold. Alluvial gold, of course, as its name implied, is gold that's been washed down by water. And it wasn't very long before this whole area was pegged out into alluvial claims. Now, an alluvial claim was a small patch of ground about 24 feet square, or around about 7.5 meters. And it wasn't very long before there were about 150 miners hard at work here. Some of the claims were quite rich. There was sometimes up to about 50 ounces of gold a week found here. The discovery of gold here, of course, meant that they had to have supplies. And for their supplies, they went down to a small shanty village called Wakefield, Wakefield, on the banks of the Clutha. But it wasn't very long before a man by the name of William Goodall decided to build a hotel here to satisfy the needs of the miners. And he built this hotel down here about 1867, I think it would be. And there you see the ruins of it. It was the first hotel built in the Bendigo area, and it still remains there, a ruin. William Goodall sold out after about 2 years and moved down to Bendigo Township. And the hotel was then taken over by a man by the name of Charles O'Donnell. It had a rather checkered career after that. After about 10 years, it lost its license because there wasn't very much trade here in the gully. It was called the Bendigo Gully Hotel, by the way. And O'Donnell carried on until he lost his license, but he continued to use it as a general store and a bakery and a butcher's shop. He operated at the net capacity until 1907. The population here had dwindled by that time, and about 1907 it was, his wife died while she was chasing a pig here, and Charles O'Donnell decided to give up. So he abandoned the hotel and retired to Cromwell, and the hotel building was just left to fall to the ruin as you see it now. Now, like all alluvial fields, they run out of gold in time, and that's what happened here. And the miners, as they worked out their claims, gradually moved away. But before they'd gone, even as early as 1863 it was, one of the miners by the name of Thomas Logan decided to do a bit of exploration. He knew, as all miners knew, that these alluvial deposits all came originally from weathered gold reefs further up the mountains. Perhaps those reefs had been weathered completely away, but in some cases traces of them remained. And it was in the hope of discovering one of those a reef that Thomas Logan set off up Specimen Gully, which is just over there. He was encouraged in his exploration as he moved up this creek by finding pieces of quartz with the gold clearly visible, embedded in the rock. And the fact that all these pieces lay there on the bed of that little creek was later to give it its name, Specimen Gully. Well, he moved on up until finally he came to an outcrop of quartz, and he took a specimen of it and realised at least he thought that he had found a gold reef. And further exploration found that the reef extended up the mountain and that it was gold bearing. So he returned to his camp down here, and we'll hear more of Thomas Logan as we go further up the hill. Now at this stage we'll move down to the old Bendigo township. Here we are on the site of the old Bendigo township. Way back in 1860, in anticipation of this becoming quite an important centre, the provincial government sent a surveyor up here to survey a township, and here you see the result. On the plan you see it was divided into blocks, and the streets were named after mostly English counties and so on, or English towns. We're here where we are, we're standing in the corner of Oxford and York Street. That was York Street running up in that direction there, and Oxford Street at right angles. Now at that time, of course, and subsequent times, there was quite a lot of building went on here. There was a store here, and further along was another hotel built. We mentioned William Goodall up at the alluvial diggings. Well, he moved from there down here and built a hotel just along here, about 3 or 4 chains down here. He called it the Bendigo Reefs Hotel. He wasn't in very long before it was burned down, but he got set to and built another one. And unfortunately, he then took ill and he died, and the hotel was sold and was moved away. The only other hotel here was the Solway. It was named after the battery which was being built down on the flat over there, and it was situated just over there. Those poplar trees you see there, I think they were about the end of the hotel. It was in behind there. Its site was could be well identified up to about 20 years ago, when the 2 chimneys were still left intact. And unfortunately, the chimneys were knocked down to make extension to that holiday place you see over there, and so we've lost the exact location of it. The Solway Hotel operated by a man by the name of Peyton for some years, and then was taken over by a man by the name of Dawson, and he was the last owner of it as a licensed premises. It wasn't very long before the population here began to decline, and the buildings were moved away, and the hotel lost its license. It was then used as a private residence for some years by first the Reed family and then the Mann family, who later lived in Cromwell, and up to about 1942 it was used in that capacity. At that stage they all moved away, and the new owner, or the owner from whom they'd leased it, he decided to demolish it, and it was demolished about that period, about 1942. We have a picture of the old Solway Hotel. Are you ready to see that? Now here's a photo of that has survived of the old Solway Hotel. You see it's a fairly basic structure. It was built of corrugated iron, and even inside it was fairly basic. The rooms were, I understand, had no doorways. They only had curtains to pull across. They had no bathing facilities or bathing facilities. All they did was they went down to the creek, the nearby creek, and had a wash, or brought a bucket of water up for their ablutions. And but that served its purpose for a good number of years. It was advertised as one of the ads it had in the early days, one of the best hotels in central Otago. Well, if that was the best, I wonder what the worst was like. Anyway, that's the story of old Bendigo Township. And from here we'll move up to the reef area. Right in the heart of the reef area. It's called Welshtown because in the early days there were a group of Welsh miners who made their homes here. You'll see the ruins of their cottages round about. We're at an elevation of about 2,000 feet above sea level here. That's about 700 odd metres. And we get a splendid panorama of the surrounding country from here. Over on the left here you see the Pisa Mountains, and away up the broad Clutha Valley there you see the Mackera Mountains that lie behind Lake Hawea. Coming around this way we come to the Grand Few Mountains closer at hand, and right over to the right here you see the St Bathans Mountains. Now we left Thomas Logan having found his discovery of a reef only about 200 or 300 yards from here was the site where he discovered it, and then returning down to the alluvial field down below, where he divulged the news of his discovery to two of his mates. One was called Brian Hebden and the other was William Garrett. And the two of them came back up and further explored the reef and decided that they might do something about it. But they couldn't do much about it because reefs, to exploit a reef requires capital to buy expensive machinery, and they didn't have the capital. So they formed a little syndicate amongst themselves, and at odd times they came up and worked on the reef just to bring some of the stone to the surface. They opened it up to about 200 or 300 yards or about 150 metres. And that went on for 2 or 3 years. At last they made a breakthrough. They found a wealthy man in Cromwell by the name of George Goodger, a wealthy businessman, and he was interested in what they were doing. They took some of the samples down to him. He had them assayed, and when the result came back of the assay, he said, "Well, boys, you have a fortune in your hand." Now, the upshot of all that was that he provided the capital, and the three partners went ahead to exploit the reef. Now, to exploit the reef, it was necessary to get a battery. A battery was a big machine for crushing the gold-bearing ore into a fine powder for it to be extracted. And they set to work, first of all, to get this battery. They bought a second-hand battery from somewhere, employed a large number of men, and they erected the battery down on the flat where we first assembled, down near Bendigo Township. Now that was some distance from from the reef up here, so they had to build a roadway down, and that roadway we came up on was the roadway they constructed from the reef area down to the battery. And they also had to provide power for their machine too, and that was provided with a huge overshot water wheel, and used the water from Bendigo Creek. After about 2 or 18 months hard work, they were all ready to go. They employed quite a number of carriers who had drays and horses to carry the stone, the gold-bearing stone, down to the flat, and they stockpiled it there ready for the opening of their battery. Another party on that ridge over there. They named it the Aurora Reef after the little creek that flowed down on this side of it. And they got to work and also built a battery. They built their battery though right in the creek bed over there, and their power came from a water wheel which was powered by water, which was brought by a race from about 10 miles distant. It came along the top of the Dunstan Mountains here, tapping all the little gullies, and finally discharged into the Aurora Creek. It was picked up and used on the water wheel again. Now the Aurora, it operated for some years, but finally ran out. But and there was quite a big celebration when it was opened. It was going to be a great success, but it didn't turn out as good as they thought. Well, anyway, getting back to Logan and the Logan Reef, they called it. At this time, they'd called it the Cromwell Quartz Mining Company. Those four partners, Goodyear provided the finance, and the three others providing the labour. Well, the day came when they had their first crushing, and there was great excitement when the result of that crushing was announced. It turned out as good as they had anticipated, in fact more so. And when news spread of the success of the Cromwell Quartz Mining Company, it caused another gold rush to this area. A gold rush not to get alluvial gold, but to find new reefs. And in no time, or short time, various other reefs were discovered. Besides the Aurora, next to it was found the Anderson Reef. The discoverers gave them names as they found them. Next to that was the Lucknow Reef. Next to that was the Bradfoot, then the Goanna, then the New Lode, and finally you came to Bendigo Creek away over about 2 miles from here. Over on the other side on our left was the B Lode and the Hit or Miss. Logan's Reef ran quite close to where we're standing here, and all the reefs ran in a slightly east-west direction, and they all dipped down at about the same angle, sloped down into the ground about the same angle. Well, as I say, this caused a gold rush to here. At one stage there were about 80 claims taken up, and about 214 shareholders, I think it was. And I might mention here that a quartz reef claim was quite different from an alluvial claim. A quartz reef claim was 18 chains by 9 chains, or around about 360 metres by 180 metres, a rectangular area, quite a big area. And along these newly discovered reefs, these new claims were pegged out and surveyed. Now, not all the reefs were gold-bearing. Some had none, some had enough just to perhaps get a wee bit excited about, and there weren't any that were nearly as rich in gold as the Aurora and the Logan's Reef. And so the excitement continued for some time, and then finally subsided as they found that the reefs weren't as good as they had thought. Of course, accompanying the gold rush, a little village grew up here called Logan Town. We're going down to see it later on. We'll talk about it then. After about perhaps within 18 months, most of these newly made claims had been abandoned, and life settled down, the centre of activity being Logan's mine. Stop it. About lodes and reefs and so on. Now those are synonymous terms. A lode and a reef are the same thing. We've also been talking about a battery. I better explain what a battery was. It was a machine designed to crush the stone, the gold-bearing stone, into a fine powder. It had to be worked by quite a considerable amount of power, and most of the batteries around here in this area were worked by huge water wheels. Now, to understand what a battery looked like, we'll have a look at a photo of one. Now here's a photo of a battery still in existence, the remains of it, way over in the Rise and Shine Creek. It gives you some idea of what a battery was. You see those 6 rods or 5 rods? At the end of those were large weights, and when the battery operated, the stone was fed into a trough underneath, a big steel trough or iron trough, and the batteries, one at a time, they were lifted up and dropped onto the stone and crushed it to a powder. Now I think you'll see another photo here of those big weights, stampers they were called, actually were used to crush the gold. Right, there you see the actual stampers, these huge weights that went up and down crushing the stone. Now the recovery of the gold from the stone took place as follows. The crushed stone, quite a fine powder, was then washed by water over copper plates or tables which were covered with mercury. Mercury is used quite extensively. Now mercury and gold combined to form an amalgam, and as the gold particles, as they passed over the mercury, were amalgamated with the mercury, and the particles of stone, the waste, was washed on as tailings. Now at a suitable interval, the amalgam was taken from the plates and it was put into a retort and heated. A retort was usually a cast iron retort with a lid and a pipe going down to another level. Mercury, of course, has a very low evaporating point, and at a certain heat the mercury evaporated, turned into vaporized I should say, and continued down as a vapor down the tube and then went back to its liquid form. The mercury now was separated from the gold, and down in the bottom of the retort was left the lump of gold, or the cake of gold as they called it.
Go.
Well, here's a picture showing an actual cake of gold with some of the old miners behind it, and that gold in that form was taken down to the bank in Pommel and deposited there. Well, from its initial crushing, the Cromwell Quartz Mining Company continued on its merry way, bringing in huge dividends for the four members of the syndicate. The three, Hebden, Logan and Garrett, were now wealthy men. They could afford to sit back, and in fact they decided to retire. Garrett was the first one. He decided to give up about 1871, I think it was, and before he'd sold his shares though, he died. He was bucked off his horse down the Lowburn Hotel and broke his neck and was buried in the old Cromwell Cemetery. That left only three partners. They bought up Garrett's shares and carried on as three of them in the partnership. But it wasn't many years before Hebden decided to give up, and he sold his shares to some outsiders, and he went back to his hometown in England, where he set up a business called Albion House in Ripon in Yorkshire, and became quite a wealthy man. Used his capital to good effect. Logan, the other partner, he sold his shares, and he remained about the district here for some years, investing in other mines. Was quite a prominent citizen in Lowburn. Finally went back to Australia, where he'd originally come from, and had a successful career as a railway constructor over there. For some strange reason, he came back to New Zealand almost penniless in the 80s, and died after a 6-month illness in the Dunedin Hospital, and he was buried in the Dunedin South Cemetery. Now, of the original shareholders, Goodyear was the only other one. He carried on as a shareholder for some years. He finally ran into financial difficulties and finished up by taking his life by jumping into the river down at Cromwell. So, apart from Hebden, they didn't live very long to reap the benefits of their early discoveries. Now, success of the Cromwell mine evoked other thoughts in those people who had abortive claims further over than those others. There were quite a few more claims were taken. They were clustered around the Cromwell mine. Some of them didn't even know whether there was a reef there. But there were quite a few, and they're all given fancy names. There's the Dauntless, the Kiss Me Quick, the Come in Time, the Who'd Have Thought It, the Dauntless, the New Britain, and about 2 or 3 others. Now, they were worked on the principle, of course, that because the Cromwell mine was getting such good returns, there must be other gold near at hand. But it didn't turn out that way. And in a very short time, those claims were cancelled. And the only mine working was the Logan's mine. Now the reef was exploited in various ways, but the main one was shafts were put down after they get down a certain distance. Shafts were put down here and there all the way along the length of their claim, and at the top of each shaft was a winding gear. There were two types of winding gear. One was what they called a whim shaft, and the other was a whip shaft. A whip shaft was just purely a pulley on top of the shaft, over which ran a rope, and one end of the rope was attached to a horse, and the other end was attached to a bucket or something like that to run down the shaft. When the horse went forward, the bucket came up. When the horse went back, the horse went down. And in this way, men and tools and so on were lowered down and brought up, and the gold-bearing stone was brought to the surface. There was one quite serious accident occurred in one of the whip shafts. One of the miners was about to descend, put his foot in the bucket to go down. Unfortunately, the other end hadn't been attached to the horse, so he plummeted down 30 feet down to the bottom of the shaft. But wasn't killed. He only had an injured foot and was back in work in a few weeks' time. That was just one accident that happened. The other type of hauling gear was what they call a whim shaft, and it was similar. There was a pulley on top of the mine, except the other end of the rope went to a kind of windlass, and the windlass was attached to a horse on long arms, and perhaps 1 or 2 horses went round and round in a circle, winding up the rope, and whatever was on the end of it. And then to lower everything down the mine, they went in the reverse direction. Now, by about 1878, they were getting very deep, and these methods of bringing the good stone to the surface were becoming a wee bit expensive. So they decided to modernise the mine. And to do this, all operations ceased while they reorganised. They decided to bring the battery up to right up to the reef area. So it was shifted, taken bits, transported up by horse-drawn wagons and drays, and re-erected at right at the mouth of the end of the reef area. And they started putting down a big shaft there. At the same time, they got a steam engine and erected it to drive the machinery, to drive the battery. Now, that took quite a while, and they also extended the number of heads. On that picture of the battery, you notice that there were about 5 or 6 stampers. Now, they could have anything up to 14 or 15, but even up to 18 all in a row. And I think it was up to 18 that they extended their battery to. And after everything was ready, the battery was christened the Matilda Battery, after George Goodyear's eldest daughter. Shows you the Matilda mine and the Matilda Battery about the 1880s, when it was in full operation. You can see the poppet head in the centre there, over the top of the main shaft. Just a small building to the left of that is the engine shed, which provided the winding power. Then the bigger shed housed the battery where the quartz was crushed. Further over on the left, you'll see two small poppet heads, as if they were just being erected. They're over the top of two quite big shafts that are still visible there. Further along, you'll see the blacksmith shop. That's the only building still remaining there. Up behind the poppet head, you'll see another building. That was the mine manager's house. There's one other building which we don't know was used for, and that completed the complex there. The miners, of course, lived in their cottages some distance away. Now this shows you a vertical section of the mine it was at that time. You will see the main shaft right on the extreme left there. It's not to scale, of course, and you'll see the quite a labyrinth of shafts and drives and so on that were driven into the mountain to bring the stone back to the crusher to be crushed. The miners down below, of course, used picks and shovels, as well as a lot of explosives. Mostly, well, it was all black powder in those days. An enormous amount of black powder were used to blast the rock into small pieces, so it could be transported on the little trolleys they had, or little trucks along rails, along to the foot of the poppet head, and then raised to the surface to be crushed. Well, this continued till about 1884, this prosperity of the mine. By this time the mine had been turned into a liability company, a limited liability company, and it had quite a lot of shareholders. They were getting good divvies out of the proceeds of the mine. But by 1884, or around about that, it was becoming more difficult to extract the stone, mainly because they were getting deeper and they were running into water, and they had to install expensive pumps to pump out the water. But at this time, it was decided that they would try elsewhere for their gold. In their claim was another lode called the North Lode, so they thought they'd try their luck there, and they proceeded then to sink a huge shaft above the North Lode in the hope of striking payable stone. And here's a photo showing the activities at the number 2 shaft.
Ready? Go.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now the failure of the number 2 shaft spelt the end of the company. Their returns were getting smaller and smaller, and so they decided to sell up. They sold up to another company, and the whole workforce was dismissed. Now a new company took over, and one of their first acts was to start a low-level adit. They reasoned that if we could put a tunnel in, an adit was a horizontal tunnel, in through the mountainside and strike the reef at a lower level, it would do away with all the long haulage to the surface and also the water pumping problems. So they began using their capital to put this low-level adit. Well, after they'd been for a few hundred feet, they hadn't struck the reef. They'd run out of capital, and so they sold up to another company. And from then on, that was the typical of the history of the mine. A company taking over a certain amount of capital, working at it, either the adit or the mine itself, getting very poor returns, and then handing over to another one. Finally, about in 1913, the whole lot of the company that was in possession at that time sold up, and the whole of the assets were dismantled and sold. The battery, the pipes, the hauling gear, the engine, everything. And that was the end of the mining in this particular area here. The biggest ruins in the Wellstown area was Pengelly's cottage, which you see over on the hillside here. Quite a substantial cottage. For some reason or other, people have got the idea that it was once a hotel. Well, it was never a hotel. It was the cottage of the Pengelly family, who were quite prominent in this district for quite a number of years. The nearest approach it ever got to being a hotel was about 20 years ago, when it was made to represent the hotel for the filming of Tom Winter's Dream by J.K. Baxter. And they put a temporary roof on it and used it for that purpose. But that remains a ruin of Pengelly's cottage, and don't take any notice of the dock plaque which designates. Well, what you've just seen is the site of Logantown. I mentioned up the hill that with the arrival of all the people who are looking for reefs, gold-bearing reefs, the population over here increased so much that business people decided to build premises up here. This was the only level piece of ground they could find. So up and down here, about 1870, there was quite a little village. There were 2 or 3 stores, there was a blacksmith shop, there were 2 restaurants, there was a billiard room, and of course there was the usual hotels. In this area there were 5 hotels altogether. There was the Provincial, the Golden Link, the Reefer's Arms, and the Old Bendigo in this area. And further down towards the creek down there, the Aurora Creek, was another hotel called the Aurora Junction. So there were 5 hotels here altogether. It had a fairly brief existence. After only about a year or a bit more, when the bubble burst as far as the reefs were concerned, they began to move away. And in a very short time, there wasn't much time left of the real township of Logantown that had been here. Now you'll realise that many of the miners had wives and children, and in due course the time came when they needed education for their children. To begin with, they employed a teacher privately, and their school was a corrugated iron structure up at Logantown, which we recently visited. It was used for all kinds of purposes. It was more or less what we'd call today a community hall. It wasn't very big, and that's where the children were educated. The parents paid in so much to provide the teacher's salary. But in due course, they applied to the education authorities for a proper school, one which was financed by the education department. And after some negotiation, in 1980, that was granted. Now, they had to choose a site, and this was the one that was chosen. You wonder why they chose a flat piece of ground up here above Bendigo Township. But the reason was that most of the children, or perhaps half of them, came from way up at the mines where we recently visited, and the other lot came from farms down on the flat. So this was a compromise about halfway between, and seemed to have been settled very amicably, the site for the school. So the wooden school was built here, and the only remains of it now are that chimney which you see over there. The school itself was operated here till about 1910. It was closed for a few years, and then in 1910 was shifted away down onto the main road because all mining had ceased up here. Now there's a rather curious entry in the old exam records of the Bendigo School. At that time, Charles Todd was the manager of the mine, and his family, including Charles Todd Jr., were pupils here. The entry reads, at the request of the parents, the Todd children are not to be taught history. Now, Charles Todd Jr. may not have been taught history, but he certainly made history. After he left here, there's a boy who went down to Harriet, and later on he established a stock and station agency there, went into motors and founded Todd Motors in Dunedin, and finally finished up by heading the big Todd Consortium, which is centred in Wellington. So Charles Todd had a very humble beginning at his Bendigo school here. Now here's a photo of a group of pupils of the Bendigo school taken about 1899. You'll notice that the teacher at the right-hand side, that was Mr. Grant. He later became quite a prominent headmaster in Dunedin. There's quite a girl there. She looks almost like a young lady. Now, she probably was just a pupil, because in those days, some young people didn't get any education at all until they were in their teens, and came along to a primary school just to catch up if they could. Right, well, about 1930, would be about that time, during the Depression, there was quite a revival of gold mining all over Otago, including the Bendigo area here. One of the companies that was formed to look for gold here took over the old adit I was telling you about a little while before. The idea was to put a tunnel into the mountain, and it was called an adit, and strike the reef at a lower level. That would save all the necessity of machinery and pumps and so on up above. So in 1930, after several companies that had to go at it in earlier years, a company was formed there by Charles Todd Jr., who I referred to up at the school, the one who wasn't taught history. But anyway, he came down, he formed the company, they put a lot of money into it, and started extending the adit. They went in about until they finally ceased work at a total distance of 2,000 feet. Now that's getting on to 800, 700 meters round about that, which is quite a long distance. They found no money, found no gold, lost all their money, and that was the end of that venture. To the abortive adit, place down here. You see a large hole here, excavated here. Now, there was a group of Dunedin businessmen thought there might be gold under these gravels here. They did test borings, and sure enough, they found at a certain depth there were quite extensive deposits of gold. And they thought the best way to get the gold out was to build a dredge. So a dredge had to be floated on water. There was no water here, so they decided to make an artificial pond to float the dredge. They engaged a couple of young unemployed men who got the contract, and they, with a bucket, a traction engine and a scoop, they scooped out this enormous hole you see here. Now those two young men, that was the beginning of a very successful career for them, because their names were Mr. Hogan and Mr. Fulton. You've heard of them, haven't you? Fulton and Hogan. Well, anyway, the company then filled the hole with water from Bendigo Creek, and then proceeded to erect a dredge, which they bought from Southland somewhere. The building of the Gold Light Company's dredge here at Bendigo, partially completed. And this photo shows you the completed dredge working. It was did it on the bank, and finally launched it onto this pond that they had, artificial pond which they'd made. And the idea was there then for the dredge to float there, and the buckets would go way down and bring up the gold-bearing gravels, and they were going to make their fortune. Well, unfortunately, like what Burns said, the best made plans of mice and men gasped after glee. Well, this certainly went to glee anyway, because they couldn't reach the lower levels of the gravels. As soon as all of the gravels were brought in one end, had to be tipped out the other end, the tailings at the far end, and they kept floating in underneath the dredge, and they couldn't get the dredge down far enough. The idea was to lower the water and then they'd reach the gold at the bottom. They called themselves the Bendigo Gold Light Company. I interviewed the last remaining director of it about 20 years ago down in Otago. And he said, for all the gold that we got out of that hole, we should have called the Bendigo Light Gold Company. And so after years' operation, they tried various things to rectify the fault, but they could never get down to the gold-bearing gravels down there. So after years' operation, the dredge ceased operations, and it was finally dismantled and sold. And with the demise of this dredge here and that effort, the curtain comes down on all major gold winning efforts in the Bendigo area.